I will never forget our first ambulance call. Henry and I decided to shadow closely behind to ensure that our staff was adhering to protocols. We showed up to find a 25-year-old West Point woman sitting in the middle of Crew Beach under the scorching heat of the sun. Her head was cast downward and she was crying, unable to walk on her own. Her family wanted to give her a hand, but because she had symptoms, they knew they could not touch her. Someone went to find a wheelbarrow to transport her in. Somehow she managed to seat herself, and Sean, our ambulance driver who was on duty that day, wheeled her toward our waiting vehicle. Just a few feet down the narrow, sandy path from where we'd found her, we met another family, all of whom were sick. A mom was holding her baby who was bleeding visibly from his mouth. Next to them, a 3-year-old girl in a Gap t-shirt was wide-eyed and scared. Without a word, as Sean opened the rear door, they all clambered into the ambulance, and then he drove them as quickly as possible to Redemption Hospital. We continued to trail closely behind in our SUV, and I was uncertain about what we'd discover upon our arrival. We pulled up to find ourselves in a long line of taxis, trucks, and other ambulances, all carrying people who were waiting to be admitted. It was a terribly hot day with blazing temperatures, and there were no windows to ventilate the back of our ambulance. Stationary, parked, Sean opened the back doors to let some air circulate without practical concerns as to whether this was a good measure or not. In the hatchback of a station wagon taxi that was directly in front of us, we watched a middle-aged woman die right before our eyes. A dozen people who were presumably the woman's family gathered on the crowded dirt road began screaming in cries of lamentation. One woman wailed so mournfully that her pain cut through me like a blade. Finally, a set of garage-like doors at the roadside of Redemption Hospital, where we were all waiting, opened. The inferno I saw inside is burned into my memory for all of eternity. People's bodies occupied every inch of the floor, the living commingling with the dead. The floor slick with blood, feces, vomit, and the stench of death, mixed with the scent of strong bleach. It overpowered me, and I had to bend over until the waves of nausea let up. Then a sort of autopilot kicked in. Henry and I ran through the open doors with bags of water in our arms and started handing them out to anyone still clinging to life. It was paramount to communicate a message of love to the sick, to show them that their suffering and their lives mattered. We did the best we could to serve the dying with dignity, with the only resource we had to offer, our water. Redemption's water supply had run completely dry. Even the buckets meant for hand-washing hygiene were empty. Just when I thought I'd lose my composure and start screaming at the injustice of it all, around the corner, slushing through a river of bodily fluids, came a towering figure dressed in full protective gear. He looked like an astronaut ready to board the next shuttle to the moon. Henry and I both froze and looked at each other, sharing the same thought telepathically. He and I were only wearing surgical face masks, gloves, and boots. We had no business being here dressed the way we were. Without a word between us, we ran outside as fast as our legs would carry us, and once we'd reached our ambulance, we got sprayed down from top to bottom with chlorine. Had we just sentenced ourselves to death? Dripping in bleach, with the fine mist of chlorine still visible in the air between us, we both began to cry. We knew that touching our faces to wipe dry our tears could be hazardous, and we had to be smarter if we wanted to survive and help others in the process. We watched as the men in moon suits sorted the bodies of the dead from the living, transferring the corpses into the back of a large Red Cross pickup truck. The health workers continued to silently zip the dead into bags, finally working their way over to the deceased woman in the taxi in front of us. Her limp head and arms hung heavily as they lifted her large body out of the hatchback and onto the pavement where an open body bag waited. The howling sobs and screams from her loved ones grew piercingly louder at the sight of her now lifeless body. I wondered if she'd left behind young children and the void that her absence would now create in their lives.